días a todo el mundo. Muchas gracias por concurrir a este evento donde trataremos de dar un semblante de la visión tanto global de los riesgos crediticios que afectan a las corporaciones actualmente en el mundo, en un mundo lleno de sorpresas y de volatilidad, y también obviamente tratar el tema local. Quería aprovechar entonces esta oportunidad para presentar a la señora Kathleen Holzman, que está a mi derecha y que va a ser la moderadora de este panel. Kathleen es la cabeza de desarrollo comercial y de relaciones con los emisores con sede en Nueva York, de Fitch, y está a cargo de América Latina para tal propósito. Y tenemos también el placer de contar con nosotros con el señor Richard Hunter, que es la cabeza global de riesgo corporativo de Fitch para el mundo. Así que sin más, por mi parte, le paso la palabra a Kathleen. Como hemos anunciado, el evento se va a desarrollar en inglés, así que le paso sin más el micrófono a Kathleen.
Gracias. Thank you, Douglas, and thanks to all of you for joining us this morning, and of course thanks to the team at Fix for organizing this at sort of the last minute, not too last minute. So in terms of format, Richard will start by giving a global overview. He has some slides he'll go through with you, and after that we will open the floor to Q&A. So Richard?
Thanks. Oh, well, it's a bit loud. I have to get used to this microphone. Right. I'm going to stand in front of the slides, which is a bit dangerous. Some of you can see I have brought a plastic leg with me, but anyway. Okay, so if I look at the slides, here we go. Great. So, as Kathleen said, and as Doug said before, I run the corporate rating group at Fitch. So we're in charge of rating all the international ratings on non-financial corporates. And this is very difficult. This would be an eye test for any of you, even at the front tables, to read. So I'll take you through it. Really, if I look at the topic we're talking about, is we've been waiting for the last, I would say, 3, 4, maybe 5 years to start seeing where the problems in developed markets are coming. We've had various taper tantrums. We've had small concerns that come up. But we've really not seen any major problems in the big, the big economic blocks. So the idea today is to say, to what extent are we seeing those now? So this was 2017, where we actually, when we sat down and said, what do we think will happen in 2017? They pretty much all happened. Le Pen didn't win the French election. Greece pretty much came out of its problems. The Eurozone, again, didn't have any particular fragmentation. Brexit is a local problem. It's not going to cause problems for the rest of the European Union. It's not good for Britain, but it really doesn't matter for the rest of Europe. Trump extreme will be avoided, so we had a lot of things that were frankly very pro-business from the Trump administration. You will find a lot of American companies are very, very happy with the actual policies, the business policies and the tax policies. China will not get into any major confrontations with other countries because of their development of soft power. South Korea wasn't going to be a problem, and there would be a wall of money staying in place. That was a big one. Wall of money stops major defaults, major runs on credit. And at that point, we kind of got to a stage where I would go out and do this type of speech, and it was very difficult to find anything where the audience would get engaged, because they would look, and if I was in London or Frankfurt or Hong Kong or Chicago, I would go through this and they would say, yeah, we don't see any problems either. And even now, when we sit down with big asset managers in New York or London or Paris, and we say, when do you see the next big problems coming? Nobody sees it coming in 2019. Maybe 2020, just because it's after 2019. And maybe 2021, because that's a long time after 2019. But nobody has any real faith in calling an end to what has been a very benign environment. Well, then we started this year, and it hasn't gone quite so well this year. So we thought the dollar would stay at the weak end of the range. That was well wrong. Obviously, the dollar has got stronger. We thought that oil would kind of stay reasonably range-bound. Our long term is $55 to $60. Obviously, we're quite substantially above that now. We thought there'd be some tweaks on NAFTA. That was correct, but not a global trade war. We thought that would be avoided, and actually we are starting to see a global trade war. China's need to delever will get pushed out by another year. I think that's probably still intact. And inflation will stay under control. And actually inflation is starting to pick up in different places. It's not a big problem yet. The other ones on the list are probably more problematic. So our crystal ball wasn't quite as good coming into the start of this year. We're starting to see cracks. But this slide, which unfortunately is the busiest slide, is probably the most important one. And the number to take away from this slide is $1.2 trillion a year. 1.2 trillion, which is what the central banks, the major central banks, have been pumping into the global economy. And that is now coming back out. Okay, now the Bank of Japan is a slightly different case, but for the Fed and for the ECB, they are pulling that money back. That is the removal of liquidity. That is the sucking sound that everyone was wondering how we're going to react to when it occurs. That is, for my money, when people say, what's the biggest risk to corporates? It's not oil prices. It's not any of the commodity ranges you might think of. It's not really technical disruption. That will hit some companies, but not most. The biggest single thing that hits all corporates is going to be that liquidity moving away. It's also going to come at the same time as rates go up. And when rates go up, and I don't have to say this to an Argentinian audience, money can leave certain parts of the world very quickly. So that, for me, that chart, that red dotted box there is showing you the liquidity being withdrawn from the US and from Europe. Europe might be slightly slower, but that is going to make a major difference. Bottom line there, when cash isn't zero, there are other places for investors to put their money. So then people say sometimes, where are we in the credit cycle? And unfortunately, I'm not particularly good at drawing on these charts. I can't draw the correct shape for this credit cycle, because the bit with the spring, it's between peak issuance, so the most debt being issued, and money leaving, so when problems start, the last slide. Now, in reality, that spring has been very long. It's been extended. So we've had an extended period of peak issuance, and then peak issuance, and then peak issuance, and then yet more peak issuance. And that's been going on for a number of years now. And we are now at the point where it transitions to money leaves. This is actually a report, no bubble in corporate bonds, because we were worried that all this corporate debt was going to create a leverage bubble. And this is a report, this is one of the last reports I wrote as an analyst, and I remember that because it was 16th of November 2010. And then we were worried about, is there a bubble in corporate debt? At that point we were saying no bubble in corporate debt. I think it's probably a different story now. This slide is a little bit easier to understand because it comes back to our ratings. Start with the chart on the right-hand side. That is, if you add up all the upgrades and downgrades that we do in a year, and then you say it's a net number, so is it net negative or net positive? That is a chart showing the cumulative, so if you just added them all up, on a rolling 12-month basis, add them all up, what's happened? Have we had more upgrades or more downgrades? And consistently, since 2013, we have had more downgrades. The dark line is emerging markets, but even in developed markets, particularly the US, which has had a great economic run for 5 years, great run, net downgrades. The other thing is, if you look on the left-hand slide, the light blue bars, the bigger part, is the existing ratings that we had at the start of last year. So that was the shape of our rated universe. And the highest number of ratings we have were in the BBB range. The dark blue, the smaller triangle, peaks at single B. And that's all the ratings we've assigned since the start of last year. that very graphically shows you how so much more of the ratings that we have been assigning have been at that single B level. If we look at that regionally, again, this is quite busy. The two lines to focus on, Latin America is the light blue number. The reality is most of that light blue is your neighbors to the north, who kept our analysts very busy. So Brazil accounts for most of that very pronounced downturn for Latin America. But we've seen a little bit of a pickup there. I should actually say for the whole chart, this line at the top here, it's almost at the top, that's where net upgrades meet net downgrades. So if it's ever below this line, it's net downgrades. So you can see that most of the world, again, has been net downgrades for the past 5 years. The interesting line, and the line that in some ways is a little bit worrying, is the, I don't know what color you call that, pink. Let's call it pink line, this one here. This is America. And this is net downgrades. Now you look at, normally ratings move in line with GDP. So GDP is good, ratings are good. America's ratings have been coming down quite substantially, this is for American corporates, quite substantially because of share buybacks and M&A activity. So that's another thing where leverage has been coming into the system. So that leaves us to a situation where we are thinking now, we've had a very good run, it's been a very positive run for the global economy, lots of appetite for debt, but with liquidity leaving, with interest rates rising, and with a lot of companies in big developed markets spending a lot of money, there's no other way to put it, share buybacks or M&A, this is probably the point that we will look back to and say that was the turn. That was the point where, if we go back to the credit cycle slide, yeah, where that spring, which is the point between peak issuance, that's where the cycle turns, moves over to the money leaves slide. We've already seen it, obviously we've seen it here, we've seen it in Turkey, we've seen it to some extent in other marketplaces, but we will see it elsewhere as well. Right, and that was my prepared comments, so at that point I will leave and hand back to Kathy.
Great. Thanks very much, Richard. Hello? Yes. You have a lot about the U.S. and a lot about the global economy. I haven't heard you mention China, which would seem to be an important factor in the global economy. So I have a couple questions. I don't know how many of you were here when Richard's colleague, James McCormack, presented on the sovereign and economic overview of the global economy. A comment he made that stuck with me was that of any sector on the planet, Chinese home building is one that is a real bellwether for growth globally. So I guess I have a couple questions related to that. First, how's it doing? And second, why should we care so much about what's going on in China home building, and I guess more broadly in China? And even that you could probably divide into developed markets versus emerging markets being more sort of the commodity exporters if we do a profile.
Yeah.
Maybe 5 questions.
Yeah, and I'll forget some of them, so I'm relying on you to remember them. If we start with the last one first, which is always a good trick, why do we care about China? I think the single word that explains it all is commodities. You mentioned commodities. China is an enormous consumer of commodities, whichever type of commodity you choose to pick, whether it's steel, whether it's copper, coking coal, whatever it is, they're an enormous consumer of that. That then leads back to why is house building so significant? It's significant for 2 reasons. One is it has been the traditional store of value for China as the Chinese population has emerged from their command economy. It has been a very significant driver of investment. It's also been, and it's difficult sometimes for people from outside to pick up on this entirely, it's been a huge financer for government, because local authorities in China generally don't charge tax. There's really not much in the way of a popular taxation system. And local authorities and local governments in China would make money by selling land. And so it has been a major financing vehicle, not just to store value for savings for individuals, but also for governments to be able to fund what activities the governments want to do. It's also been an enormous consumer of the commodities, cement, copper, and so on. So that's why it's always seen as such a bellwether. And I suppose when you ask why, how's it doing, there's a lot of answers to that question. We actually publish a regular thing called a China Property Watch. We rate something like 50 Chinese house builders, which is about 40 house builders more than we rate in any other country in the world. They're mostly rated in speculative grade. But in that, if you look at where the numbers are now, house sales are still growing. But it's one of these things where you say, what's the trajectory of growth? And they are growing at a decelerating rate. So last year was 14%, it's down to 7% on aggregate now. House prices have generally been flat, which is a bit of a recovery. We had one major city where they were actually down earlier this year. So there's no great cause for concern, I would say, necessarily in the volumes or the pricing around house building. I think what there is, and this is something we have flagged repeatedly, some cause for concern on, and this is another thing that even I find difficult to fit into my head, is the Chinese domestic market for bonds is $2 trillion, which is kind of the same size as the US domestic bond market, which is kind of a mind blower. A lot of that is bonds that are generally held by banks. So it's not anything like the US bond market in any other way except its volume. And within that bond market, one of the big differences is here people go to the bond market for tenor, for length, for maturity. In the Chinese bond market, it's very short term. So it's a lot of the stuff, half of it is basically less than 3 years, and a third of it is commercial paper, which again is short tenor. Isn't really bonds, but that's included in the total. And there's one particular feature around house builders, which is in the Chinese bond market, a lot of the bonds have puts. So you can actually put the bond back to the issuer if prices change. And that's very rare outside China, but very common inside China. It's about 1 in 5 of the bonds in China, but it's half of the bonds in the property sector. 49% of those bonds have a put mechanism. And you can cure that by paying a bit more in your coupon, but even then, the investor has the right to put that back to you. So it's one of those latent systemic risks that we don't think would cause a crisis, but if a crisis was underway, it would be a big accelerant. It would be a massive amount of gasoline on a fire. So that's just a couple of things I would say on Chinese home market.
Great, thanks. Before I open it up for questions, one more China-related question. Sitting here in Latin America, we see more and more involvement of China in the local economies. I think The Economist had something on the cover this week about China's involvement in Europe. We published a report, I guess, late last year on outbound China M&A, so I guess Fitch knows something about this. Do you want to make any comments on, sort of what the trends are, what we've seen historically, if you see any change in those trends going forward?
Well, there's one thing I said on the slides, which was soft power. So China has been looking to extend its soft power. It also has an excess of, obviously, construction capacity and engineering capacity now, having built several high-speed rail networks almost simultaneously. So what we've seen in the up until 2016, there was a lot of M&A activity. So Chinese companies were buying assets. Now, there were some big ticket items. So in particular, actually, I've got a slide on this. There's so here we go. If we flip through this, at the end here, yeah. So that blue bar there is showing you Chinese outbound M&A, and that's in billions of dollars. That's 200 billion in 2016. Now, what's interesting is, when it started off, it was mainly natural resources. As you can imagine, China wanted to make sure it could get control of oil supplies and ore supplies. But then it diversified a lot. It was going into media. It was going into, in particular, utilities. Now, utility M&A makes no sense. I've always said, makes no sense. but they were overseas M&A activity for utilities. But they were getting very heavily into that. So the fancy colored thing at the bottom is showing you how diverse China's M&A was. So they were going to lots of different sectors. And then in 2017, it pretty abruptly stopped because the Chinese government essentially told them to stop. And the main reason they told them to stop was they were worried about capital flows. They were worried about the currency. They didn't want that money leaving. And as a result, what they've replaced the outbound M&A with, and they were buying, I mean, the Economist article is right, they bought a big chunk of the Portuguese power system because it was in financial trouble with the Eurozone crisis. Many, many examples like that. Now it's the Belt and Road approach, which obviously is now an extremely long road and an extremely long belt. So on that basis, that's where we're seeing Chinese M&A go. That's where we're seeing the activity go. And that's why now, probably the single biggest indicator when I land in an airport as to Chinese involvement is not the sign of Chinese industrial equipment about the place, but the adverts on boards for Chinese banks who have very significantly stepped up their lending activities around the place.
Thank you. I'd like to open the floor up to questions. Would anybody like to start with a question? If not, okay. Sure. Why don't you start? I have one more, then we'll go to you. So let people think a little bit. Just because you sit in London, I have to ask you about Brexit. You sort of alluded to it out there. It's not a big deal. It's a localized problem. How do you? I mean, there's a lot in the news. It does seem like there won't be a real agreement. That seems like a real possibility. Sitting in London, how do you view this? And is there really no impact on corporate credit?
So, we tend to look at things through a prism of what do we rate. And it might surprise a lot of people to know that in the UK, there's relatively few rated companies that just do business in the UK. So the UK is like, frankly, a lot of other countries where most of the funding for domestic companies is done domestically by the banking system. So when we look at the companies we rate, it's people like BP or Vodafone or large international, or Rolls-Royce, large international companies. Many of them in services, but many of them with operations overseas, where Brexit doesn't matter other than the exchange rate. So bad Brexit equals weak pound. The pound has actually been holding up surprisingly well. For companies where it's really going to be, if there is no deal, which I agree with you is an entirely realistic possibility, where it hits companies is in their supply chain. And there was a story about one of the Japanese automakers' facilities in the UK. If they had to stock 3 days worth of equipment, which they'd have to do if we don't have a deal on customs, they would have to build a warehouse that would be the largest man-made structure on Earth. And this was just for one automaker to hold 3 days worth of all the things they need. They have parts that arrive at the factory within 45 minutes of being fitted. And if you then go and say, well, we have to have all these border checks, we have to unpick a supply chain that's been working for the last 10, 15 years. Now, for that Japanese car company, we just upgraded Toyota. I think it might have been the Toyota factory. It was either Toyota or Nissan. They absolutely can sustain that type of rearrangement. They have flexible platforms. BMW are moving production out of the UK for their Minis. Jaguar Land Rover are moving production out of the UK for both the Jaguar and the Land Rover series. So the companies themselves, it will cost money, it will be disruptive, but the impact is vastly, vastly greater on the UK. So we would say that this would be like, we've had a number of, one of the problems when we look at the impact on corporates is corporates just generally deal with developments as they come up. It could be there's a volcano erupts in Iceland and shuts down European airspace for a week. Corporates deal with it. Supply chains are interrupted, but people absorb it, they get on with it. Obviously, corporates are much less levered than banks. They have much more cushion. They generally carry lots of cash, et cetera, et cetera. So when I say there's not much of an impact, when we look at the Rolls-Royces or the Airbuses, who obviously have, they make the wings in Wales, and that would be threatened by Brexit. Those companies, it would cost them something, but when we've looked at it, it doesn't raise to the level that we would call a rating downgrade, which means it's not existential. For the UK, it's terribly bad news.
Thank you. Douglas.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. I'd like you to comment on your views regarding the trade war between China and the US, and how do you think that could impact emerging market corporations?
I think the issue is always, it's the secondary impact, not the primary impact. So our economists looked at they did a simulation as to more or less the volume, I think it's 400 billion of Chinese imports that they modeled with 20 or 25% tariff rate. And there were two interesting things from that. One was the US was much more hit than China. 1% of US GDP, 0.2, 0.3% of Chinese GDP. There were some small impacts on China's supply chain countries. Obviously, China politically can absorb a lot because their political system is fairly rigid. The US much less so. We've already seen with some countermeasures to address problems for farmers that have been created, very rapidly addressed with the subsidy offer. So that in itself, 1% of GDP in the US does nothing, okay? It's not a big mover at all. US is on course for 4% GDP growth this year. The big issue is the secondary impact, the sentiment impact. And I think that goes back to the point about the withdrawal of liquidity. If US rates are going up, and remember the US Treasury is, the T-bill is the store of value when people run to in times of trouble. Even when America's in trouble, people run to the T-bill. When the US was downgraded by another agency, you know, the price on T-bills actually went up because people were rushing to store in US government debt. So I think the impact is going to be a sentiment-based one, that when people go into a risk-off mode, emerging markets are the first place that's hit. It also doesn't seem to be doing the US dollar any harm as a currency, which again, we know the strongest single factor that is negative for emerging markets is the strength of the US dollar. So we would look at it and say it's not the primary impact, so whether or not you're on a list or not, and what we found is that auto companies and steel companies have generally been able to manage around that. It comes down to the sentiment issue and what that does to the general economy in emerging markets.
Okay.
Do we have any questions from the audience? You can talk and I'll repeat your question.
I'm interested in knowing what is your view on corporates in Argentina.
Great, thanks for the question. The question is about corporates in Argentina, and I think because the next panel will focus on Latin America and Argentina with our head of corporates for Argentina, maybe we'll save that, unless you want a big, very big picture, like globally.
Well, we've just given my colleague Dan a great heads up on his first question when he comes. Obviously, we rate the cross-border side of things. Douglas's team does a fantastic job of rating companies locally. So we have tended to see the industries that come up are going to be natural resource industries, you know, the traditional companies like telecom companies. The one observation I would make is, and I'd make this in almost any emerging market, it's very encouraging. I'm spending the week here hearing these types of stories to see how well corporations in emerging markets who've dealt with crises year after year can adapt flexibly to what's happening. It's a real testament to management skill, and we're seeing that here, but obviously there's a limit to even what skill can do if the currency devalues by 50%. But I think that's probably a great introductory question for Dan when he comes up for the next session that comes.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I'm going to take you up on you mentioned, and we've said for a long time, and I think there's now sort of consensus, that it's not just high interest rates, it's also the strong dollar that's been very difficult for emerging markets or very challenging. And so my question is, the euro could, a stronger euro could take some of the heat off the dollar. So I'm wondering if you can comment on what is keeping the euro relatively low compared to the dollar, and if you see any prospects for a stronger euro that, again, you might take some of the heat off the dollar.
There's probably, and again, I'm not a currency strategist, but from where we sit, I'd say there's probably a few small things and one big thing. So the few small things would be, politically speaking, there is still a certain amount of there's always one part of the European family that is experiencing more challenges. Right now, there's a lot of focus on Italy, which has a very significant debt burden and a very significant continual refinancing burden. And that's putting Italy in the headlines a lot, which I think is weighing on the euro because it plays into the Eurozone story about solidarity between North and South. Interestingly, as a sidebar, it's a great example of the asymmetry of news. Spain is doing far better than anybody expected. Spain was in part of the Club Med group that people were concerned about during the Eurozone crisis. Spain has outperformed our projections, everyone else's projections, doing really well. Has had some internal political issues around Catalonia, but no one's talking about that. They're talking about Italy because people tend to focus on things that are immediately of more concern. So there's some politics there. Brexit is possibly a slight overhang, but I don't think it's a particularly big overhang. It's more of a news flow issue. On a day, it might dip a cent or two. But the biggest single thing is rates. So the ECB has been far more committed to holding interest rates lower. So we don't expect an interest rate rise in Europe, despite pretty good growth, particularly in the north, until September next year, and then maybe another one towards the end of next year. So right the way from now, to basically until a year from now, we see no change in the ECB's interest rate, which just relative to the another couple of hikes this year and then 3 next year, we think for the Fed, just opens a very substantial, arithmetical gap, as it were, for supporting the currency.
Great. Are there any other questions from the audience?
What about Brazil with the news about holidays?
So, and again, Dan will be able to expand on this a little bit more. What we've looked at over the last, I'd say, 3 years, when you saw that slide of all the downgrades that were happening in Latin America, they were largely driven by Brazil. What we've seen there was a confluence of events, which to some extent, I guess, we've seen here replicated a little bit because you've had a Lava Jato experience yourself with the notebook crisis. Having those things come together at the same time as a profound fall in commodity prices, and with obviously with the political uncertainty that Brazil undertook with the change in presidency, all of those things dent business confidence, they dent consumer confidence, they ultimately are hugely fertile areas for crisis. What we look for, and we are as a company extremely politically agnostic, we don't favor any particular ideology or agenda. What is good for ratings and what leads things to move from bottom left to top right is stability and predictability. And the predictability thing is a big deal. We were talking about this yesterday, and it's a similar situation we were just talking about with Brexit. Whether it's a 5% hit or a 10% hit or a 20% increase or a 10% increase, even if you say it's not a big hit, but you're not quite sure, the uncertainty is what holds people back from investing. So I think to the extent that at the end of this process, Brazil ends up with a new administration that can promote a higher degree of consistency and predictability, that would be positive for the environment there. Obviously, a large part of the debt issuing sector that we look at from an investor's perspective is state-owned. And stability there and planning there and recovery there would be a key bellwether for us to look at.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Very shy. I have one about, it's kind of a global question. It's about M&A generally. I feel like when I look at the Fitch website, every other week, we're rating some other financing related to another mega deal. And so there, globally, there's a lot of consolidation within industries and across industries. Some of that's happening in Latin America, not so much Argentina right now, but we have seen consolidation in retail, in power, in Latin America. From a credit perspective, how do you view M&A, and how do we look at these kinds of mega transactions?
It is an interesting question because I think there's an underlying psychological current which worries me slightly, but we'll get to that in a minute. I think generally how we look at them is very simple. We look and we say in like 2 years out from here, are the numbers approaching the numbers that we think are consistent with the current credit rating. So if somebody goes out and spends a lot of money, how quickly do they recover? How quickly do they work off that extra debt that they've acquired? And what we've actually found looking back over time, I asked the team, can you check how many times when we affirmed a rating, so kept it the same, did we end up having to change our minds? Or how many times when we downgraded, do we end up having to change our minds? And what I found is it's very, very rare that after a big M&A transaction, 3 years down the road, we decided we had to change our minds. So that is almost comforting. That kind of says, okay, so a lot of the theory behind this consolidation seems to be working. It's making companies bigger, it's allowing them to take out costs, it's allowing them to become much more competitive. The US marketplace in particular is much more concentrated than it was. One of the reasons why cell phones are so ludicrously expensive in the US is because there's a very high level of concentration and market power there. So, but then if we flip down and say, what's the psychological thing that's maybe a little bit more challenging behind that, is why go to M&A if you could just expand yourself? In theory, M&A should be more expensive, right? But there's a lack of confidence in organic expansion to build a facility to compete with a competitor rather than buying the competitor. And what we found is, I think there's, from the management meetings we have, there has been a psychological shift in the boardroom between primacy being given to organic expansion. So you look around the board table and say, who's going to bring me a plan to build a new facility or a new product or a new way of competing, relative to primacy now being given to there's probably a financially engineerable solution to acquiring a better product, better competitive position, better distribution channels, whatever it is. And I think that has led, as a result, and I think why that's challenging is, that's fine when money is cheap. Because you could say, well, then it's a 50-50 ball. If money is very cheap, you can choose to expand organically or you can choose to expand by buying things. If, as money becomes more expensive, as it is becoming, if you've lost the skill set to expand organically, if you rely effectively on people coming to you with a plan how to buy the competitor as opposed to beat the competitor, then there's an element where you might be losing a certain skill set from the top tables in corporations. So I think that's kind of like the psychological sidebar to me that I worry about on the M&A side, that there's been that shift from saying, frankly, we'd rather just buy something than try and build a competitor product. And we'll see how that works out.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have a question? You want? Okay, sure.
Yes. Could you comment on the U.S. high-yield corporate risk coming forward?
Yeah, it's funny because whenever we quote a global default risk, we typically quote the U.S. High-yield default risk, and it's been ridiculously low. It's been around about 2% for the last 3 years. We actually just had 2 months where there were no defaults at all in supposedly the most sophisticated risk market in the world, and probably is the most sophisticated risk market in the world. So we look at that and we say these default rates of 2%, through the cycle it should be north of 5%. We're below the average for non-recessionary years, so we're below the average for good years. Inevitably, those defaults will come in a wave. And so I think there's 2 things to think about. One is, what's the transmission mechanism for that wave? Because we had retail, had a bad experience in the US, as you will have seen. Oil and gas had a bad experience in the US. Really, while the sectors themselves had a bad time, it didn't move the overall default rate from being very low. It was sector. It was very specific. There was no big wave. So the transmission mechanism for everybody, we think, is rates moving up. And not the interest rate itself, because the interest rate is still very cheap, as I'm sure this audience would appreciate more than many. What you're paying for domestic funding in the US is not expensive at all. Our companies could sustain 300, 400, 500 basis points increase in their interest costs without a significant damage. It's what happens to people holding bonds who see the price of those bonds go down because interest rates have gone up. They go to their asset manager and say, I want to move out of bonds into something else. Then the asset manager has to hold cash to pay that redemption, and he doesn't put it back into the bond market because he's got people who don't want to invest in bonds anymore because their prices are going down. That, we think, is the most likely transmission mechanism that would cause more defaults in the high yield sector. The other thing, and there's a thing for this, it's difficult to read this even when I'm sitting on the stage, but we'll send you these slides around later. But there's lots of colors and shapes on this, but the size of the box is how much of the leveraged loan market, which is now actually bigger than the high yield bond market in the States. It's overtaken it. It's over $1 trillion in size now. And the big boxes are the ones that have the biggest share. The red boxes are the ones that have the most distressed credits. So the red boxes, you can probably read retail, oil and gas. Not a big surprise. But not the biggest boxes. Biggest box right now is between technology and services. So what's interesting about that, and there's another one on the far right-hand side, you'll see health, which is a very, very big component of the higher risk, the speculative grade credit market in the States. These are all asset-light companies. These are companies, technology, for example, if you had to rank recoveries, so how much money you get back after a default, if you had to do that for, where do you get the highest recoveries and the lowest recoveries, traditionally we've said lowest recoveries come in technology, which is now the biggest sector. So if there are defaults in these sectors, you're going to get low recoveries. There are also sectors that traditionally did not carry lots of debt. There was no need. Right? You weren't building factories or pipelines or buying aircraft. They were not capital intensive. So the debt there has tended to come from M&A, so it's companies that buy each other. Or, if they think it's a successful company, it's been bought and levered up. So it's just been made more capital efficient, to use the term of art. So that is one thing that I think we are monitoring very closely. And our ratings, again, we also assign ratings to losses, not just defaults. And that's making a significant difference to the profile of the market. More asset light, more chance of more losses when defaults do arrive.
Great. All right, last chance. Do I have any questions from the audience? So just to wrap up, coming full circle, the IMF came out today, more negative on growth for 2019, 2020. Fitch came out right before the IMF in September, similarly, pulling back our growth numbers for 2019, 2020. We talked about tightening financing conditions globally, deteriorating quality, credit quality of the corporates that we rate. What are your just big picture predictions for 2019, 2020? That's a hard question.
It's a hard question because we are kind of the everything else sector. So it would be difficult to pick on one particular sector and say that we thought there was going to be a big problem. We don't think, as we said, we don't think there's going to be a rush of defaults going into next year. We do think, and we were actually saying we thought 18 was the peak year. I think at the start of 2017 we said we thought this year would be good, 1920 would go downhill, and as you say, we've pulled back our expectations. It's less about the overall level of economic growth. For us, it really does come down to the availability of finance. And I think for a lot of the corporates that we look at, just a continuing supply of sentiment to those marketplaces. So yeah, if you looked at my oil price prediction, that was off. If we looked at our prediction for the dollar, that was off. So I think we've been a little bit on the optimistic side. So as we look at our forecast going into 2019, we are looking just to make sure that we are reflecting this level of weaker growth in the individual company forecast too.
Great. Unless somebody has a question, raise your hands now. No? Okay, then thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Douglas.
Yep.
Thank you. Bueno, pasamos entonces un poco a ver la visión desde el punto de vista de Fitch local respecto a la situación no solo de las corporaciones, sino rápidamente, vuelo de pájaro, de cómo estamos viendo la situación de deuda y situación de riesgo de crédito de los distintos sectores que nosotros analizamos. Obviamente nosotros, si tuviéramos que explicar cómo estamos posicionándonos en los comités para decidir, vemos la posibilidad de cuál es la posibilidad del gobierno de sostener el programa largamente buscado de reducción del déficit fiscal, sobre todo debido a la necesidad de implementar esto de acuerdo a los términos comprometidos y de acuerdo a el programa trazado, que implicaría déficit fiscal prácticamente, o no prácticamente, sino cero. ¿Cuál es el grado de resistencia que puede esa meta tener? Después, capacidad para sostener un volumen adecuado de reservas, que es el otro problema, porque el sostén de las reservas tiene que ver precisamente con la relación tasa de interés y tipo de cambio. ¿Cuál es la posibilidad de reducir el pass-through devaluatorio, sobre todo si se aspira a que el grado de recesión esperado no sea tan grande como el que uno podría anticipar si queremos que toda devaluación y toda mejora del tipo de cambio real no pase directamente a precios y se pierda o evapore rápidamente? La renovación de la deuda, este es uno de los problemas más grandes. Recién preguntaron sobre las corporaciones en Argentina y como lo veían, uno de los problemas más grandes que nosotros consideramos que tiene que estar en el radar es cuál es la capacidad de renovación de las deudas que empiecen a vencer en el próximo año, año y medio. Asumiendo que muchas de las empresas que emitieron tienen un adecuado perfil crediticio y lo que enfrentan es un problema de liquidez y no de solvencia, podemos sentirnos relativamente optimistas en la medida en que la situación macro no desaliente demasiado fuertemente a los inversores internacionales. Tasa de inversión a futuro. Hoy en día sabemos que la tasa de inversión en Argentina es bajísima, obviamente con una expectativa de recesión como la que estamos viviendo y la que suponemos vamos a tener por lo menos entre 8 y un año. La tasa de inversión va a estar muy focalizada y eso también lo analizamos. Y sobre todo, ¿hay luz al final del túnel? ¿Y para quién? No todos los sectores están enfrentando la misma situación. Y la pregunta es pertinente porque en realidad nos encontramos con un panorama de incertidumbre y falta de confianza. Eso generó en la Argentina un problema serio de liquidez y no de solvencia. Si miramos las perspectivas de la Argentina en mediano y largo plazo, sobre todo en algunos sectores que pueden tener un fuerte impacto en la situación de las empresas y de la economía en general, el panorama en mediano y largo plazo es bastante bueno. Tenemos con los precios de petróleo en los niveles actuales, la probabilidad de inversión en las áreas para fomentar vaca muerta, por ejemplo, son muy buenos. Si estamos hablando de entre 5 y 6 productos brutos, la inversión para extraer las reservas que están comprobadas tanto de gas como de petróleo. Tenemos la expectativa de la producción agropecuaria, que es muy buena, y con un tipo de cambio más competitivo, muchas de las economías que se encontraban, las economías regionales que se encontraban con dificultades, pueden llegar a exportar y ser sustentables. Las provincias, yo no sé si por una cuestión de tiempo voy a poder explicar demasiado sobre la situación de los subsoberanos, sobre todo aquellos que nosotros calificamos, pero las provincias, gran milagro, se están encontrando prácticamente con déficit cero. Tenían muy poco, para colmo, en general no tenían gran nivel de endeudamiento en relación a su PBI, y por el otro lado han logrado equilibrar sus cuentas. Provincias que han pasado muy malos momentos y que inclusive han hecho ajustes virtualmente durísimos. Por ejemplo, Santa Cruz, que para la visión de todo el mundo es una provincia que tiene serios problemas. Bueno, Santa Cruz está llevando adelante un programa radical de reducción del gasto, seguramente porque no tiene muchas otras alternativas. Bueno, hay provincias, las provincias petroleras se encuentran en muy buen estado, sobre todo con los nuevos precios y las expectativas de regalía, salvo las provincias que no han pasado sus cajas jubilatorias debido a la posibilidad de que tengan ingresos asegurados, es decir, no discrecionales por parte de la nación a las mismas, implica un gran crecimiento. Así que desde el punto de vista de lo que solía ser un problema y que todavía en nuestra mentalidad se encuentra como una vulnerabilidad seria, están superando el problema. El sistema financiero sigue estando sólido, el sistema asegurador ha mejorado bastante y si bien no podemos hacer demasiada mención por una cuestión de tiempo, nos encontramos con un sistema asegurador que sigue teniendo una fuerte dependencia de la rentabilidad financiera más que la rentabilidad técnica, que debería ser su negocio core, y algún grado de dependencia del regulador, que más que pensar en la solvencia de las compañías en términos de la capacidad de respuesta frente a los asegurados, muchas veces piensa en términos de lo que puede ser, me están diciendo que me corra porque si no, no sale, en términos de lo que podría ser la alocación de carteras de inversiones de acuerdo al mejor criterio de las aseguradoras y no de acuerdo al criterio de política económica o política financiera trazada por las autoridades centrales. ¿Cómo se llega? Bueno, obviamente es la duda más grande. Vamos a tener que atravesar, si consideramos el programa actual como un programa que tiene sentido y mucho más consistencia que los programas anteriores, pero es un programa muy duro. Entonces la pregunta es, ¿se podrá llegar o el trazado de lo que en papeles se ve relativamente bien será lo suficientemente discutido como para que se repita la historia, no solo de la Argentina, sino de otras partes del mundo, donde tarde o temprano los bancos centrales dejan de apuntar a la política exógena y empiezan a preocuparse mucho por la tasa de interés y cómo eso está reflejando en la economía. Bueno, este es un panel, en este slide lo único que estamos mostrando un poco son nuestras ideas de crecimiento, inflación, tipo de cambio, etcétera. En cualquiera de ellas vemos que el pronóstico implica que vamos a tener que sobrepasar este problema de liquidez durante un tiempo, lo cual es difícil. Y es muy importante el tema de liquidez porque los inversores internacionales prestan particular importancia a la situación macro desde el punto de vista de liquidez. Cuando hablamos de cuáles son los problemas estructurales o fundamentales de los países emergentes, uno encuentra que son emergentes precisamente porque tienen ciertas debilidades con relación a mercados maduros. Sin embargo, no todos se tornan vulnerables. Hay muchos de esos mercados que son precisamente considerados moscas blancas donde no hay de qué preocuparse. Sin embargo, otros se encuentran vulnerables. El problema en general cuando uno analiza las crisis ocurridas en el mundo desde la década del 80 es en general cuál es el grado de liquidez que tiene cada una de las economías, visto en términos de capacidad de generación de recursos externos, desde el punto de vista de reservas y desde el punto de vista de perfil de endeudamiento y de vencimientos, como para afrontar esos compromisos. Afortunadamente, Argentina desde ese punto de vista ha mejorado significativamente respecto a lo que conocíamos o habíamos visto a partir del primer trimestre de este año, con el acuerdo con el Fondo Monetario Internacional. Pero ese acuerdo no es fácil de cumplir. Una cosa es el planteo y otra cosa el seguimiento. Pero es un punto favorable. ¿Qué riesgo, desde el punto de vista micro, qué es lo que vemos? ¿Qué riesgo crediticios estén expuestos a tasa? Obviamente, como se comentó acá y como hemos comentado en muchos de nuestros trabajos, las tasas de interés real que están pagando las corporaciones y están pagando en general todos los tomadores de crédito en el mercado local son insostenibles en el mediano y largo plazo. Así que es de esperar que el programa empiece a mostrar sus frutos en 4 meses o 5, de tal forma que el panorama sea decreciente. Tipo de cambio, tenemos un tipo de cambio competitivo. Debido a la recesión no ha habido demasiado pass-through con relación a la historia. El pass-through es importante en Argentina de todas formas, pero con relación a la historia. Pero uno de los problemas que comentó recién Richard es el de la incertidumbre. Y la incertidumbre en Argentina respecto al tipo de cambio, su volatilidad es serio. Los precios internacionales, la guerra entre China y Estados Unidos, que puede expandirse por proteccionismo en el mundo, es un tema serio para un país como el nuestro, donde estamos necesitando de una balanza comercial que se dé vuelta, del fuerte saldo negativo a que sea positiva, y somos productores de commodities. El superdólar, ya se comentó sobre el mismo, y obviamente esto es una preocupación para nosotros, y no solo desde el punto de vista de lo que se comentó respecto a la evolución de los mercados y cómo esto afecta a los mercados emergentes, pero especialmente en el caso nuestro por el nivel de endeudamiento en dólares. Este es un país bimonetario y analizar las economías bimonetarias no es fácil porque no es tan sencillo encontrar libros de texto que expliquen adecuadamente el comportamiento. Es muy difícil. Busquen hagan research en la academia y van a ver que hay muy pocos que hayan escrito sobre el comportamiento y la experiencia de las economías bimonetarias. La guerra comercial, ya mencioné, el acceso al mercado. ¿Cuál es la posibilidad de rollover que tengan las empresas? Bueno, acá un pequeño análisis. Las corporaciones se encuentran, dependiendo del sector, y eso lo vamos a ver después, pero dependiendo del sector, algunas corporaciones se encuentran perfectamente bien, sobre todo aquellas que se encuentran en los sectores energéticos. El sector agropecuario pasó por una muy mala cosecha y previamente por una mala temporada, por los niveles de endeudamiento o por las distintas restricciones que encontraban desde el punto de vista del tipo de cambio, etcétera. Ahora eso se da vuelta y para esos sectores la situación mejora, lo mismo que para algunas economías regionales. Desde el punto de vista de aquellos que están dedicados al mercado de consumo, vienen pasando y van a pasar seguramente todavía un mal momento. Bueno, no quiero ampliar demasiado en eso, vamos a ver cuáles son los ganadores y perdedores. También ahí las empresas que proveen servicios públicos probablemente no se van a encontrar con las buenas noticias de ajustes que los lleven al equilibrio desde el punto de vista de precios, sin contar con subsidios adicionales, pero de todas formas también se encuentran en una buena situación. Bancos están en general sólidos, lo que notamos en el sistema financiero es una reducción significativa de su rol de intermediación financiera. Una gran parte de sus activos están colocados en títulos públicos para constituir encajes o por liquidez. Así que nos encontramos simultáneamente con una buena situación, un buen nivel de solvencia, porque al estar colocados en gran parte de sus activos en activos líquidos, títulos públicos, requieren menos capital también. Por el otro lado, el sistema financiero ha experimentado bastante bajo nivel de morosidad, el cual se ha incrementado pero sigue siendo poco significativo. Han sido muy cuidadosos a través de estos años los bancos y eso se refleja claramente en que las carteras no se han deteriorado demasiado y desde el punto de vista de perspectivas, las tasas que han obtenido han sido sumamente rentables y ahora estamos hablando de tienen hasta encajes rentables, así que la perspectiva del sistema sigue siendo buena. Como todos sabemos, el sistema financiero es muy dependiente de la situación macro y de la percepción respecto a la solvencia del Estado. En la medida en que estos próximos 2 años estén más o menos asegurados respecto al Estado, también eso refleja favorablemente en las entidades financieras. Provincias, ya me referí a ellas, algunas provincias pueden llegar a tener algunos problemas porque se le están transfiriendo los cargos respecto a tarifas o respecto a los subsidios de transporte. Entonces, no le va a resultar muy fácil en un año político a algunas provincias transferir plenamente el año que viene al precio de los servicios o al precio del transporte las cargas que ahora se han colocado en su cabeza. Así que ese puede ser un factor determinante de mayores dependencias fiscales y mayor déficit para algunas de las provincias o para todas. SGR es simplemente decir que siguen siendo un interesante vehículo prácticamente sui generis en la región para financiar a las pymes. Se han transformado en los, por excelencia, me muevo así, la cámara me capta, se han transformado por excelencia en los expertos que garantizan y conocen más a las pymes y que las apoyan. Por ahora la cadena de valor está bien manejada y eso ha sido de gran utilidad. Financiación estructurada, lo que notamos es que, bueno, casi el 80%, el 20% del total de las emisiones argentinas son financiaciones estructuradas, es decir, fideicomisos. Y de ello, el 80% aproximadamente son estructuras de consumo. Y como todos sabemos, el consumo es precisamente uno de los sectores más afectados en esta crisis. De todas formas, dadas las características de los estructurados que precisamente permiten segmentar en categoría de preferencia de riesgo por clases, de acuerdo al apetito del inversor, mejor riesgo, más baja tasa, al contrario en el caso de los certificados de participación, la situación desde el punto de vista de morosidad, etcétera, ha funcionado bastante bien. Tenemos un mercado sumamente achicado porque le afectó la situación cambiaria y la situación de liquidez a algunos inversores institucionales, sobre todo los fondos comunes de inversión, y por el otro lado nos encontramos con que hubo algún episodio, algún siniestro con algunos de los que eran comercializadores de artículos para el hogar y electrodomésticos, etcétera, específicamente Carsa, que acaba de salir de su concurso de todas formas, acaba de levantarlo, pero todo eso también implicó alguna mayor preocupación y bajó el apetito por ese tipo de inversiones. Sin embargo, los fideicomisos se han sostenido muy bien y han funcionado, inclusive el de Carsa, que se pagó en todo momento. Por otro lado, también en general en la Argentina los servicers, los que se encargan de la administración y el cobro de las carteras, son los mismos fiduciantes y la experiencia ha sido hasta ahora muy buena a pesar de los malos momentos que en algunos sectores se ha vivido. Así que fideicomiso, diría, sigue siendo una historia de éxito en la Argentina, está relativamente bien defendido institucionalmente también, respaldado por precedentes judiciales que ayudaron a la institución. Los fondos, bueno, ya comenté, los fondos se encuentran achicándose, el problema de la volatilidad, el problema de las carteras les afecta, pero de todas formas, desde el punto de vista de manejo, administración, lo vemos muy bien y creemos que la tendencia puede continuar un poco, pero hasta ahora el manejo desde el punto de vista del enfoque de la calificadora es bueno y no vemos mayores problemas, solo obviamente la probable reducción y la selectividad. Y las aseguradoras básicamente tienen, el mercado asegurador tiene un problema de tamaño y de desconcentración. Demasiadas aseguradoras, problema también del sector financiero, donde es probable que eso se pueda revertir una vez que Argentina nuevamente entre en un ciclo de crecimiento y de inversión. Esto yo no me voy a detener demasiado en este cuadro, ustedes lo van a poder ver, lo vamos a publicar, así que va a estar a disposición de todos ustedes. Así que simplemente mostrar acá cuáles son los que se encuentran en mejor situación contra los que enfrentan algunos problemas más serios. Lo mismo respecto a este mismo cuadro, también del sector corporativo, probablemente se vea después, pero también nos parece importante destacar el tema de que hay ganadores y perdedores, como ustedes pueden ver. Bueno, esto lo voy a pasar, son todos cuadros que tenemos nosotros sobre el tema que me parece que se pueden ver después y muchos de ellos ya lo conocen porque esta es una audiencia calificada. Nosotros también aprovecho acá para pasar un mensaje de publicidad gratuita, que es, les recomiendo leer el informe de perspectivas crediticias para el 2019, donde ahí con más detalle estamos montando todo el panorama que avisoramos y Dios quiera que acertemos. Finanzas estructuradas, acá ven la caída significativa en el volumen, pero de todas formas, y acá en cada uno de los sectores de las emisiones vemos cómo se está comportando el mercado de capitales vis-a-vis el mercado de productos estructurados. Entidades financieras, yo creo que ya hablamos suficiente para dar una rápida visión, baja penetración del sistema versus el PBI, eso ya lo conocemos y lamentablemente esta crisis evitó que siguiera creciendo el sistema y como dije, y al igual que las aseguradoras, tenemos un mercado demasiado atomizado, lo cual no sé si es bueno o malo. Si uno mira la tendencia mundial, uno diría que hay demasiadas entidades para este mercado, pero por el otro lado, cuando aparecen estas crisis, uno se da cuenta de la ventaja de la especialización y de la segmentación de muchas entidades. Y en general están todas sólidas. Bueno, estos son los gráficos que van a estar disponibles para que ustedes los puedan observar con más detenimiento, pero acá quería mostrar respecto a las provincias un comentario que hice anteriormente, que es el crecimiento que van a tener de acuerdo a lo acordado entre las provincias y el gobierno federal, cuál es el crecimiento que se obtiene de las transferencias automáticas, con lo cual se elimina para las provincias la gran incertidumbre de aspirar a contar con transferencias discrecionales. Eso se va reduciendo, pero la contrapartida de las transferencias automáticas, que desde el punto de vista macro y desde el punto de vista de riesgo crediticio es muy importante. Esperemos que no ocurra esto, ¿no? Yo cuando escucho a algunos haciendo un comentario optimista, me la imagino al libro de Génesis y a Noé hablando con todo el mundo, viendo una tormenta bestial aproximándose y alguno diciendo ante Noé: no se preocupen, no entren al arca porque es solo una nube pasajera. El mejor consejo es, obviamente, tomar las precauciones del caso, observar paso a paso cada uno de los sectores, que es lo que hacemos nosotros, segmentar, tratar de no llegar apresuradamente a algunos juicios de valor que pueden ser equivocados, sabiendo diferenciar y conociendo uno a uno cada uno de los emisores, sus fortalezas y sus debilidades, que es para nosotros el secreto de una buena calificación. Así que, sin más, si tienen algunas preguntas, con gusto las voy a contestar, pero les agradezco a todos por la paciencia. Muchas gracias.